Hello, everyone. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I'm happy to welcome you to our second installment in this year's Media Impact Forum, focused on addressing climate change through various media efforts, including journalism, documentary film, and advocacy communications. Today's program is about sharing stories from the front lines, support and security for activists, Indigenous communities, and journalists. We've got a great lineup of speakers who will enlighten us for the next hour on this topic, and then we will welcome all of you to join the conversation with questions and comments for a half hour of continued dialogue. And if you would care to offer a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time in the next hour and offer your question there. Then we'll invite you to voice your question in the Q&A segment that follows. In our first program, Democracy Now! Host Amy Goodman interviewed marine biologist Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and award-winning actress and activist Jane Fonda in an inspiring discussion of their work. And then Amy joined Wallace Global Fund Executive Director Ellen Dorsey in a dialogue moderated by Alex Jacana of the Gates Foundation. And that all showed how philanthropy can step up its support of the critical work for environmental impact. If you missed it, you can see their fascinating discussions on video at our website, mediaimpactfunders.org, as you will be able to watch and share this video after our program today. And today we're going to hear about the important work of storytellers on the front lines and what we can do to support them and keep them safe. Our program is divided into two segments, with the first session focused on partnership between the National Geographic Society and the Ford Foundation to support journalists and Indigenous voices. And then we're very fortunate to have Tracy Rector join us to lead that discussion. Tracy is Managing Director of Storytelling at Neotera Foundation, where she brings to her work 2 decades of experience as a community organizer, filmmaker, educator, and more. Without further ado, thanks, Tracy, for leading this discussion.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name's Tracy Rector, and I am joining this conversation from Puyallup Tribal Territories in what's currently known as Washington State in the city of Tacoma. It's important to acknowledge that we are on Indigenous lands, and I'm always grateful to be a guest on these territories. I'm excited about our call today and feel just so enlivened in this moment of great change in our global world with the brave storytellers who are out there as guardians defending land and culture. And am grateful to those who are supporting that work to happen. First off, we'd like to introduce Mark Climaco, the Strategic Communications Officer from the Ford Foundation, who in partnership with Rachel Stretcher, who's also joining us today, created a fund to support Indigenous storytellers. We will hear first from Mark, then Rachel, and then we'll hear directly from a wonderful storyteller, Michael, about his work in Guyana. Mark, hello, how are you doing? Can you please let us know what inspired the creation of the fund to support Indigenous storytellers?
Sure. So at the Ford Foundation, kind of our main mission is to tackle inequality in all its forms. And in the context of climate change and Indigenous peoples and natural resources, we take a look at kind of how natural resource extraction has been expanding in the global South specifically, and how that has been driving inequality and injustice and climate change. So our work really focuses on ensuring that natural resource governance reflects the public interest and the aspirations of rural, low-income, and Indigenous communities who claim customary rights to their lands, or have secured land rights. And over the many years that I've been at the Ford Foundation, I have been working directly with Indigenous leaders from Latin America and Southeast Asia, and communities in Africa as well who are dealing with, with extraction. And they've taught me quite a lot over the many years. And and they gave me essentially four different learnings. And one of them is that Indigenous peoples want to connect with people in cities around the world. They want to connect with young people. They want to connect with movements. They want to connect rural issues or forest issues to urban issues, because really you cannot address one without the other. And on top of that, we know that like Indigenous peoples constantly face like this negative narrative that they are backwards or primitive or poor people in need of development projects to get them into modernity. These really, it prevents them from really developing or sending out their message, more effectively around the world. They want their voices to be elevated globally on a variety of platforms. And they want to break these negative narratives. They want to tell more positive stories.
Thank you for that. It's just such important work because the stories are there, the energy is there, the talent is there, and you help to bring to the table the resources to magnify all of that.
I think one critical, important point is I think for too long, a lot of other people are really telling their stories on their behalf. And that's really kind of created misinformation or misrepresentation. And, they want to be telling their own stories in their own words and on their own terms. And that's why I reached out to Rachel, at National Geographic, so that we could, think about, the different ways that we could develop a pipeline, right, of storytellers, whether that's journalists who can cover more, more stories from the territories themselves, or Indigenous storytellers whose voices can really be elevated on the global stage.
Thank you for that. And that provides a wonderful segue into Rachel. Hello. Good morning, Rachel.
Hi, Tracy. And thank you, Mark.
So Rachel is the the Senior Director for Storytelling, really overseeing grants, programs, and fellowships. I'm curious why this partnership with Ford was right for you, and what does it mean from your lens to support Indigenous storytellers?
Yeah, thank you. This partnership came at really the perfect time, just as we were recognizing that so many of the stories, particularly stories of the natural world, left out voices of Indigenous and local communities. And this isn't just a moral failing, it's a practical one, right? And it leaves out the voices of people who hold such power and wisdom in these spaces. And so we had already been thinking about that, and also thinking about leveraging stories about tropical rainforests, especially focusing on these Indigenous and local communities when Mark and his team came into the picture. And so it was this perfect confluence. And I will say that this was a wonderful partnership around funding, but it wasn't limited to that, right? So that team brought a lot of thought partnership and connections and wisdom, because we had been doing a lot of outreach with our grant making and made a lot of efforts towards reaching these communities, but recognize that we have a whole lot to learn about how to do this right. And so even over the course of leveraging these funds, we started with one funding period, and then recognized that we were told that in certain communities that that deadline was during planting time, right? And so it wasn't ideal for Indigenous communities to be trying to apply for a grant. We made the grant available in the application available in Bahasa, Spanish, and Portuguese, as well as English. But we also recognized that that wasn't doing enough either. And so as we split out the funding into 2 periods, we decided to give more time, and also to allow people to submit a letter of interest in any language that we would then get translated and then work with the most promising of those to complete a full proposal. None of these, I would say, are enough, and yet it's getting us to a place where we're starting to build the relationships with communities, so that we can find that talent. And I think Michael is such a perfect example of that, where we were introduced to Michael and his team through Ford, and we're able to work with him to understand what story he wanted to tell through these funds.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that you brought up the role of language and connecting in languages. So you mentioned one Indigenous language. Is there a consideration, as I understand, there's multiple communities who are very actively and culturally speaking and creating from their language base. Are you looking towards expanding your translations of the documents and the open call process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think moving forward, it would be wonderful to be able to offer these in more languages than what we have up in that document. Currently, our workaround for that has been to support people to apply in any language, to not have any limits, because you start to expand a little bit and then you say, well, why not this language? Why not this one? And so our solution to that, which is inelegant and should be improved upon at some point, was to make sure that people could apply in any language, and that then we connected them with the right supporters who could work with them to apply in Spanish or English.
That's fantastic. And that brings me to just the thought in terms of partnerships and your experience for those who may also be in philanthropy watching, and other support organizations. What are your, I would say, your top 3 learning experiences from this?
Oh, it's a good question. I think they align with what I've mentioned, which is to really do as much as possible to meet people where they are, which is around both geography and language, to make sure that we're lining communities up with support. I think the other is that these relationships really take time, and so we've worked over the course of about a year, and we're continuing to work to ensure that we give people time to apply, that we see the work coming into fruition, that we're able to fund in the right places. And I think you asked for 3. I think the other is what how valuable it is to have a relationship both with your funder, but also with other partners. That's more than just, here's some money, go do your project, but it's truly about making connections mutually and making sure that that you're co-creating a project.
On our end, it's really critical to listen to the needs of the people that we're trying to serve. So as a funder, we are not there to tell our partners what to do. We are there to support what they're trying to do. So it's been really critical, especially for me and for our grant makers, to position the voices and the needs of the Indigenous peoples that we work with at the forefront, especially as we develop, and so what I've done, over the last few years is to kind of, based on what I've learned, based on what I've been told, help identify opportunities for other partnerships beyond the Ford Foundation that could really, help the communities on the ground do the work that they're trying to do. And so that's mission critical.
Do you see a shift in how other philanthropies and organizations are in partnership with Indigenous communities in recent years? And do you feel that your role modeling is impacting some new awareness?
I think over the last, like decade or so, there has been a shift in terms of how funders, have been, working with communities at the front lines, especially Indigenous peoples. I think there is kind of this new sense that as funders, we have to be putting, the people that we partner with on the driver's seat. And instead of that top-down relationship, it's a partnership, between philanthropy and organizations and communities. But the people who are driving that partnership really are the people we're supporting. So I think that's kind of a big shift over the last decade, I feel.
Wonderful. I just love to hear these transformational stories. As someone who's been a filmmaker for 20 years, an Indigenous filmmaker in the field, we've come a long ways in terms of support and resources. And it's just so heartening to see our Global South brothers and sisters really being recognized in this moment, and that shift happening there as well in support of their work.
Yeah, and
Um,
so just to add to that, Tracy, I think, it's hard, right? Because philanthropy is like this black box. People don't really understand kind of what happens within the philanthropy circles. And there's variations of how relationships are developed with their partners. At Ford, I think, if I could, if I could show like the level of conversation between, our grantees and our grant makers, it is super, dynamic. It's very interesting. And I wish, right? I wish I could have some of these conversations be out there in public so that people could really see the level of partnership, that happens, between at least this new model of funder, partner grantee relationship, because it's super dynamic.
Before we shift over to Michael, I just want to ask one last question from the partnership. What are your goals and hopes for the remainder of this year, given our dynamic reality?
I think we're seeing, we've made an attempt to give as much grace and time as possible, and so we've made the decision to push back our deadline even farther to October. Also recognizing how hard Indigenous communities are being hit by COVID-19, and trying to ensure that there is enough space for those communities, but also that those stories remain told. And so on a short term, we have a fund open for all journalists covering these stories in their own communities, and are pushing hard to ensure that stories of Indigenous communities are also told. And we have a number of really exciting storytellers open in that space. But more broadly, overall, we're telling all of our grantees that they have as much flexibility as needed to do the work well and safely. We're extremely cautious and careful about not about avoiding any sort of vector situation with this situation, with this scenario. And so we're trying to be as cautious and graceful as possible for everybody.
On our end, because we have been working on tackling all forms of inequality, we've only seen, the crises, the pandemic, the economic recession, the globally, and and domestically, how the Black Lives Matter movement have been resonating globally as well. So we see these kind of situations really highlight and spotlight, and exacerbate like all forms of inequality. So at Ford, we've been doing quite a lot when it comes to responses to what's happening right now, and and we're increasing the level amount of funding and support that we're providing to our partners on the ground, because civil society is at risk at this point. There's a lot of support that they need right now around the world, not just in the United States. But what I would also say is that, when we look at kind of how we've defined our strategies as a philanthropic institution, it just, like it's just very clear we're not changing any of our strategies, right? Because it's what we've found is the strategies are right, and the support that we've been providing to our partners have been right, and now we just need more. We need to do more, and so we're challenging other philanthropies to do more, to respond to the moment with the right amount of support, because it's mission critical at this point for our future.
Thank you so much for bringing up intersectionality of the movements and in this moment. I appreciate that. On our end, we're so heartened to see, for example, the Wayuu peoples in Colombia, how they've been very vocal about their solidarity and support with the Black Lives Matter movement, and creating stories around that too, and the impact and the awareness from that experience. Well, Michael McGarrell, thank you for joining us today. Michael's a National Geographic explorer and a member of the Patomona Indigenous peoples, working with communities across Guyana. And Michael, are you there?
Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome. If you can please share with us about your work and your experiences as a grantee of this partnership.
Thank you, Tracy. First, I must acknowledge the funders for making this possible, the Ford Foundation through the National Geographic. I believe that with resources, we'd be able to tell more of our stories, and I think this partnership has given us that opportunity to tell the stories. Many times we have the stories to tell, but the know-how to do it is usually not there, and I believe that through more partnerships, through more collaborations similar to this, we'd be able to tell our stories so that those out there can hear. As Mark was talking earlier about some negative narratives, these exist, and we want to change that. We want to tell those positive stories which can give people a different perspective of who we are as a people, how we live, what we do, where we do it, and why we do it. We want to tell this too, and we want to tell it from our own perspective. And I think this grant gives that opportunity to us directly. I believe that in us telling our stories, we'd be able to influence those who make authorities, who make decisions, like the policy decisions which affect us in one way or the other. By us telling our stories, we can help influence, how those decisions are made. And I think this is very important, because many times decisions are made on our behalf without our consent. And it's one of the things that we need to change. And I believe that with our involvement, then we can have better decision making, which can help us as a people, which can help our countries as a people, and ultimately help the planet. Because we believe as Indigenous peoples that we play a key role in ensuring that the planet remains safe. And we do that through the protection of our forest. The forest means quite a lot to us. It means everything to us. We get everything that we need from the forest. And it's important in the story that I want to tell through the grant that was granted to me, through the National Geographic, is telling the story of, the oil race, because the oil is here now in Guyana. We have just found oil, and it's already causing quite a lot of issues. But with oil will come money, and with money will come infrastructure development. They will push roads to places where there weren't roads before. This opens up our forests to mining. It opens up our forests to logging, and so many other things. And we want to tell that story of our lands, because our lands mean quite a lot to us. So the journey in telling my story will be across the country, covering different landscapes and telling the stories of the mountains, of the rivers, of the creeks, of the communities, because they all have some sort of meaning to us. They all have some sort of significance to us. Some are sacred, some are important because of specific reasons. And we want to tell the world that. We want to tell the story so that people can understand that. And we believe that telling it from our own perspective, of course, with support, technical support from others who know how to do it, can really send the clear message to those who have to make decisions on our behalf. We believe that as Indigenous peoples, we should be making our own decisions too, right? There is something called self-determination, that we should be able to decide what it is that we want as development, because what the outside world sees as development may not necessarily mean development for us. It may mean destruction, and we want to tell that story from our perspective. So we're going to do this through film, we're going to do this through GIS, through mapping. We want to show, we want everybody to understand, to have a better visualization of what exactly is happening. And as a result of that, I would like to share a short clip of a video that I would have made some time back, telling a little bit about our land.
Thank you, Michael.
Over the years, many of our lands has been given out as mining concessions and forestry concessions without our consent, and it's one of the things, one of the many issues that we have in our region. Our peoples have continued to suffer because mining interests now are taking up most of the lands and want to prevent our people from carrying out their activities, their normal traditional customary activities as they used to. How can we change this? We're hoping that by mapping our lands, by showing governments that these are the areas which we use and this is how we use them, then we may be able to convince them that they need to ensure that our land rights are being protected. Not just protected, but they must respect our lands. They must respect that we need recognition to our customary and traditional lands, and make it possible by ensuring that we have our titles and have our lands demarcated as well. So what we are doing is just trying to ensure that we have enough data, enough evidence that we can show others that this is how we use our land and this is where we use our land.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm sorry, I was muted. Any last words that you would like to share with the community watching and the audience watching?
Yes, like I said, resources will make this happen. And many times as Indigenous peoples, we don't have the resources to actually put these stories out there. So there is need for funding support to ensure that we have the tools which are necessary that can help us to tell these stories, because we have nice positive stories that we can tell, but there are also negative stories that exist out there in terms of how our people are being treated, how our people are living. We need to share some of these stories as well. So with support from donors, with support from those who have the resources, we can definitely do a lot more, because this has created a space where the younger generation are also learning from the older generation, in that they're asking about these stories. Tell us the story about this mountain. Tell us the story about that river. So there is a transfer of knowledge. And I think this is one of the greatest benefits we can actually get out of this, is that the younger generation are actually learning more about the stories about their land. And this, I believe, will give them that motivation to continue to fight and struggle to ensure that the land remains theirs. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for the important, how in my community we say that spiritual work. Thank you for that good medicine, and thank you to Mark and Rachel for supporting these processes and these communities to uplift their stories in the way they want to tell them. Your partnership's much appreciated. And with that, we'd like to transition into our next session. Thank you, everybody.
Okay, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you especially to Tracy for leading such a thoughtful conversation. And I love the fact that you did it from your kitchen. Actually, just the other day, Amy Goodman said in her comments that she views media as a huge kitchen table that stretches across the globe. So I really feel like you're embodying that spirit that she shared with us the other day. In any event, in our next session, we're going to hear from 3 different organizations working to keep journalists and storytellers like Michael on the front lines safe from legal and physical distress. We've known for many years this can be dangerous work, and it only seems to be getting more dangerous year by year. Until now, here at home in the United States has been seen as a beacon of press freedom, but particularly during the protests over the murder of George Floyd, the press has been increasingly targeted by police with physical beatings, tear gas, and wounding from non-legal ammunitions. All of this to say that the concern for the safety and security of journalists and activists on the front line is no longer a far-off concern, but one that we are experiencing much more vividly today. That being said, we're very fortunate to have with us Molly Bingham, who's not only engaged in media philanthropy, but also a veteran journalist herself, having reported from hotspots around the globe for top media outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and many others. Molly's going to lead our next conversation, but before we hear from Molly and her panel, we'd like to share with you a short video from the Ford Foundation on the importance of supporting Indigenous communities and what impact they can have on climate change. Okay, Molly Bingham, please take it from here.
Great, thanks, Vince, and thanks to the previous panel. That was really interesting. I'd like to invite my my panelists to turn their cameras on, and I'm going to just introduce this by saying I've covered conflict as a photojournalist, a reporter, a filmmaker, from Chiapas to Central Africa to Iraq. And as a freelancer, I was almost always accountable for my own safety and security. And I know firsthand how the best practices for staying safe can dramatically vary from environment to environment and over time. So I was delighted to be asked to moderate this great panel to spur your thinking as supporters of those who collect information in the field on how to constructively work with your grantees to create effective safety protocols for their work. Now, this is a really big topic, so we'll keep this informative on a high level and encourage you to consult the resources that the panelists will cite and reach to them for further conversation and ask questions during the Q&A. But if we start off by recognizing the range of information gatherers that you might fund, whether they're activists or filmmakers or journalists, and then within each of those practices, the range of collaborators whose safety really needs to be considered, from the grantee that you actually fund to the subcontractor that they might work with, and even the people that they illuminate through their work. So we can quickly see that the issue gets pretty big and knotty. But luckily, we have representatives from 3 organizations here today that can help us unpack this safety yarn ball and get you on the path to constructively including safety in your thinking as you work with grantees. So I'd like to introduce Lakshmi Parthasarasi, who's the Chief Operating Officer of the Global Press Institute, which trains and then employs local journalists around the world. And then Prash Naik, who is the General Counsel to the Doc Society, which provides an incredible connective tissue for the documentary film world in a lot of ways. And then also Priscilla Neri, who's the Associate Director of Programs in Latin America for Witness, which trains citizens and activists in the use of visual media and technology to protect and defend human rights. So we have this whole range of actors and information gatherers in the field. And I'd like to throw open the conversation to the 3 of you. And Priscilla, I'd like to start with you, but we'll all of you can answer this question in sequence. Can you take a few minutes to just talk about your organization and how your organization thinks about safety for the community that you serve specifically? And then please include what kinds of resources you've developed or can share that might be useful for donors so we can get those out in the chat and the conversation sooner. So Priscilla, let's start with you, and then Prash, if you could go after her, and Lakshmi, you can bring that up at the end. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be here with all of you. I'm a fan of your work. So I'd like to share just some thoughts. It's a really big topic, and 4 minutes is not enough for a Brazilian to explain anything to you. So I'm going to try and keep it very top line, just around this theme of security and frontline media production. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Can folks see that?
Yes.
Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with Witness, Witness is a 30-year-old global human rights organization that started right after the Rodney King riots, the Rodney King video in Los Angeles, with this idea of the power of frontline videos and stories to transform and to achieve justice. Our mission is to make it possible for anyone, anywhere to use video and technology to protect and defend human rights, whatever that means in their particular context. And we know that the landscape has changed quite dramatically in the almost 3 decades since we were born. And with the technologies of smartphones and other ubiquitous filming devices, we really see a human rights defender as anyone who uses their phone to commit an act of human rights defense, even if that is filming something you know needs to be seen and exposed. It's borrowed from CPJ's definition of citizen journalism. We work at 3 levels, just to explain a little bit. At the core center, our bread and butter, what we live for is direct support on the ground in 5 different regions where we have staff. Helping human rights defenders think about how to use video as a tool for documentation, for advocacy, and for evidence. This includes a lot of work that we do currently in Mexico and in the Amazon region with several different indigenous communities that are teaching us how they're using this visual documentation to assert their rights to that land and produce evidence. So our current programmatic priorities globally are around state violence, land rights, and war crimes. And we also do a lot of support around freedom of expression protests. So that's at this core center here. One circle out is what I call layer 2. It's thinking about the broader 6 ecosystems around layer 1. and trying to support them with digestible, fast, timely guidance on how to use video safely, securely, and effectively. So if you think about that in a protest setting, we see that there's a lot of harm reduction that could be done if we support activists to think about risks to the people that they're filming, risks to themselves, and how to reduce those risks in the use of media in those settings. So that also happens in 5 regions. We leverage international dates, viral videos, and other types of news hooks to try and share this guidance in a format that's that makes sense. And then the third level is really advocating to the technology giants and to the technology platforms on which a lot of this activism happens. So it's a harm reduction kind of strategy of helping these tech giants step into their responsibility of doing less harm to activists and human rights defenders on their platforms. I was thinking about what to share, and this is a photo from a training that I participated in Ecuador in the Cofan territory. Very inspiring use of video there with the Alianza Sebo network. I was thinking about what I can share in terms of what we've learned of how to do safety and security right. So I think the first thing is that we always think about it in a very holistic ecosystem approach, right? It's an ongoing process, and the most effective way to do it is prioritizing collective over individual solutions, and also not prescribing a set of solutions like mental health, for example, irrespective of context, right? Because we know different cultures have different ways of thinking about mental health. The second one is do no harm. It seems obvious, but it still happens so much. So don't be heavy, don't be oblivious. Know that if something happens to you when you're in a local partner's area, that's gonna be their problem, right? To help solve, because they know the area best. So how do you not be heavy? How do you not add burden? How do you not do harm? The third one is with and not to, right? So these conversations around security and protection should be had always with in a very decolonized mentality. So I am not coming to share best practices. I am not coming to make things better, right? This is a very deep local partnership that takes time, that really tries to value local expertise. So it's not, for example, hiring an international consultant to go do a security assessment of the knowledge that's already there locally and then paying that consultant and not compensating the local community who's actually sharing the knowledge and has that knowledge, right? So it's also a dance, because we know that accumulated trauma can also lead to underestimation of risks. So after you build trust, that's where you can find your dance of also sharing other perspectives, other experiences. The other one is trust and humility in all ways. I often say that the ethical should trump the legal, right? So it's not about signing a paper of informed consent. It's really about our ethical responsibility as we go there. Mind the narratives. So how narratives lead to belief systems that really prioritize some lives over others, that prioritize buildings over communities, that prioritize development over indigenous rights, right? So how we mind the narratives and how we counter narrative that, how we empower the frontline communities to and work with the frontline communities to tell their story in ways that can help change that narrative. And the only way to change the story is if we change the storytellers. I have 2 more and then I'll stop. Preemptive scenario planning versus crisis mode, right? So, you know, what are the 2-3 things that could happen and what do we do in each one? And include the boring ones there too, because usually we're like, we talk about the flashiest one, but sometimes a traffic accident is your more likely scenario, right? And then the last one is language justice. So put that burden on yourself, right? Don't send a translated long template text heavy, right? Language is not just about text, it's about oral, it's about visual. This is a great example that I wanted to share from Frontline Defenders on helping communities with low literacy to think about security in a very moving way. How does it change if there's someone who can actually push the rock onto your home? How does it change if that person has a lever? And just an illustration of how this is fast moving and needs to be a continuous dialogue. I will stop there.
Great, thank you. Prash, can you take it?
Good morning. Good morning from Sydney. I'm delighted to be taking part today. Doc Society is an organisation based in London and New York. We facilitate the best documentary films in the world, working collaboratively with funders and filmmakers, and we act as a facilitator between the two. Our interest in security has always been at the heart of the organisation for many years, but in 2017, we worked with the Doc Funders Network, a collective of independent media funders, to address what we saw as a growing problem of the inadequacy of safety and security as a remit issue within documentary filmmaking. We felt at that time, and this was reflected with the processes that were already available, that journalists working in investigation or news reporting had more ingrained and rigorous structures in order to ensure the safety of their teams, their subjects, and the production as a whole. And we felt there was a gap in the market and that this needed to be addressed. The solution was an initiative called the Safe and Secure Initiative. Delegates will be given a link to it shortly, which is effectively a global resource tool, both for filmmakers and for funders. And it's important to stress that the two are very, very important in this initiative. The checklist consists of identifying 5 or 6 key areas of risk: digital security, journalistic accountability, legal security, subject security, reputational security, and high-risk location. So it covers a gambit of areas, and it involves effectively a checklist which the funders and the filmmakers work together collaboratively on to identify strengths and weaknesses in the potential production and to plug those loopholes at a very early stage in the production. And then if the program or the film is likely to give us risk to high levels of risk, a more detailed risk assessment through a high risk location document, and then backed by a handbook which contains the very best global resources that are available for filmmakers. It's very important that our thesis behind this was to ingrain a culture that risk management and risk mitigation is at the heart of filmmaking and funding, and is not a secondary or a latter consideration down the line. And also to ensure that filmmakers and funders embrace this as part of a kind of a cultural awareness around their projects from the outset, and that it was an ongoing responsibility through the production. And therefore, as factors changed on the ground or globally, that producers and the funders could therefore adapt these processes. And essentially it was to kind of provide reassurance to filmmakers that funders were across the detail of this, and likewise for funders to make sure that there were no sudden surprises or hidden expectations down the line, and that there was a very full and frank discussion from the outset about risk management and risk mitigation. Linked to Safe and Secure, and because of the COVID pandemic, we have more recently developed a new protocol. It's not strictly part of Safe and Secure, but it's based on the same framework around safety and security. It's backed by Field of Vision and the Sundance Institute, and it was launched a couple of weeks ago. And again, a very similar framework. It has an ethical threshold at the top to identify the kind of public interest justification versus the proportionality around risk and risk management, a risk assessment, and then a resource tool about the best practices currently available. And with this document, we've made this a live document because of the changing circumstances. And again, it's freely available to all filmmakers and funders, and I would actively encourage you to access it. But overall, both documents and initiatives are there to kind of embed risk management and risk awareness within the body of documentary filmmaking for both funders and for filmmakers, and to make it very clear that this is not a tick box exercise. This is about identifying errors of ineptitude, as they're often referred to. These are errors that are caused because you fail to utilize the knowledge you have. And if those areas had been utilized from the outset, those risks would have been minimized and potentially reduced altogether.
Thanks, Prash. Lakshmi, over to you. Let's hear about Global Press Institute.
Thanks, Molly, and thank you, Media Impact Funders, for having this conversation. It's great to be on a panel with both Prash and Priscilla, who are taking this work so seriously, and I appreciate the approach that you all are taking. So at Global Press, we're an international media organization that trains and employs local reporters in undercovered media markets. So places such as DRC, Zimbabwe, Haiti, Mongolia, some of the places that we operate. And for context, we have over 100 staff around the world where we operate these over 40 independent news bureaus, and in some of the most challenging environments. So we developed a duty of care program that focuses on 4 aspects of local journalist security. That's legal, physical, emotional, and digital security. And this is all when evacuation is not an option because our reporters are locally based. Unfortunately, this is actually a really unique approach to safety in the news industry. And that's just because we've decided to prioritize the security of the whole person. It's challenging, but it's both necessary and possible, as we've shown over the last 14 years. You know, often organizations believe that security needs to just be focused on a one-time training. You get in, you do your hostile environments, you get out, and that's it, you're set to go. But if hostile environments or other trainings aren't reinforced by newsroom or organization-wide policies, it's next to meaningless to attend one of those trainings. Policies, procedures, practices, open communication, and just a basic foundation of trust that's institutionalized across staff and with leadership is the Global Press approach. So at our organization, we focus about 75% of our duty of care approach on our policies, protocols, and this institutionalized practice. And then 20% is with trainings, and about 5% is on crisis response. So part of this is just obsessing over the local details. I've heard my colleagues mention this already, but you know, that local approach, that hyper-local approach is so critical to plan and to prepare our reporters, whether it's mapping and tracking transportation routes that we're all aware where reporters are going on assignment, and knowing how much fuel is in the trunk of a car, to simple things like daily check-ins. Whether it's been Ebola in DRC, the Easter Sunday bombings in Sri Lanka, or the current COVID-19 crisis, we always approach our duty of care with this holistic approach, regardless of the scenario. We gather an accurate local picture of the crisis. As we know, we can't rely on the local picture from official reporting or official responses. We leverage our network of reporters as assets, not liabilities. It's a really important shift in our framework. We focus on team members' mental health and well-being. In 2018, we made a serious and significant investment as an organization to develop and build a professional network of wellness counselors who are available unlimited to all of our reporters. They speak the local language of our reporters, and these are essentially private unlimited sessions that our reporters can take advantage of. And in 2019, after we surveyed our reporters, we recognized that over half of our reporters took advantage of this resource within the organization. And then finally, it's really critical, again, to take note of local constraints and priorities. As we are all so focused on the coronavirus right now, this virus will compete with other acute and chronic crises, such as mosquito-borne dengue or other basic challenges that our communities face. And organizations that respond without taking this into account or without inviting our reporters into that response. And no matter how well intentioned a plan or a protocol might be from headquarters, if the implementation isn't really taking local constraints and priorities into account, that will be a failed attempt at approaching any kind of response to a crisis. And you know, this has been the work of Global Press over 14 years, really taking our duty of care holistic approach to local journalistic safety and security for the last 14 years. And I'm proud to share that recently we received the Chester M. Pierce Human Rights Award from the American Psychiatric Association for this work. And you know, it's wonderful to be celebrated, but I hope that's a call to action to so many other news organizations that need to be prioritizing duty of care and not just safety and security.
That's great. Thanks, Lakshmi. So I hear three big themes that overlap for all of you. And the first one is really like, listen to the ground. Let the people who are in that space tell you what they know and how they feel and their way of thinking about something. The second is no one size fits all sort of template, that this is a framework of questions more than a template of answers or protocols. And the third one is, it sounds like this is an ongoing evolution of conversation, that in any environment things change and they change quickly, and that being in touch and being flexible and listening is really key to successful strategy for safety. So with that, I'd like to take a next question, and we don't have a huge amount of time, but you know, this gathering is largely focused on climate issues, but I do think if you could speak, and some of you have started to address this a little bit, but if you could speak to the unique challenges that are presented right now by COVID and the demonstrations globally around racial equality, how do you think those working realities are different, let's say, than what you've already put on the ground? Like, what are they bringing to the fore for you that maybe wasn't, you know, as far forward in your thinking or your approach that donors might need to hear right now? Who wants to go first? Put your hand up.
Okay, I'm happy to chip in.
Great,
here.
Prash, thanks.
So I think COVID and the current riots in the United States, and also those in Hong Kong, raise quite an interesting issue about how you balance proportionality of risk. So for example, if you're strictly complying with COVID, you should be social distancing, but as we all know, social distancing in a riot is near impossible to achieve. And at the same time, I would be more concerned for filmmakers and journalists in terms of the repercussions of a police baton, tear gas, pepper spray, arrest, detainment, seizure of rushes. So what we're trying to get filmmakers to think about is to not put all these little ideas, these risks in different boxes, but to think about it in a holistic way and think about, what is the immediate risk to me? How do I manage that risk? Yes, there's the COVID issue, which is the long-term risk, but I need to manage the immediate risk to me and also to my subjects. And this is very important criteria within the Safe and Secure Protocol, that we wanted to encourage people to think not just about their teams, but the people they work with on the ground. And as Lakshmi said, you know, they don't have the opportunity to leave country, they remain in country, and therefore the risk for them remains very real and the potential repercussions. Equally, your subjects of your film, an area sometimes forgotten by filmmakers, is that there is a duty of care towards them. What are their expectations? What do they think that they are getting involved in? What do they think they're going to get out of it? And when does your responsibility end? Because it can't be an open-ended relationship. Setting those parameters from the outset is very, very important. So I think one of the things COVID has certainly achieved is a much greater recognition of the importance of safety and security across all genres of filmmaking, because the risk arises from the minute you leave your front door, which has never happened before.
Great. Priscilla or Lakshmi, do either of you? Yeah, Priscilla, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to note, I feel like this is not only exacerbating all the structural inequalities that, you know, we've been fighting against for generations, but it's also providing a very an excuse for authoritarian leaning governments or corporate governments that have been corporate captured and narco governments, you know, to really use the state of emergency as an excuse for excessive use of force, for less transparency, for lack of proportionality in the response. So how do you balance a public health concern with human rights principles around proportionality and transparency? So I think we really need to keep an eye on that. And also, as we look at the global protests, there's still issues around visibility, right? And they're very linked to power. So in Rio, for example, the police killed 177 young Black men just in the month of April, right? Compare that to what's happening in other parts of the world and how much attention that's getting. So there's also a challenge of global solidarity and really seeing this interconnectedness as an opportunity for us to power and realize the power of us working together, as opposed to continuing in our silos and corners.
Yeah, Lakshmi. And then we'll do a quick lightning round.
Yeah, I would just add, one, this holistic approach that Prash is addressing is just even more heightened right now in this moment, right? During coronavirus, during this crisis, you may have been used to dealing with, as an organization, 1 or 2 communities at a time, 1 country at a time, but this is everywhere. This isn't a moment where you can't, frankly, you can't go anywhere where there is no coronavirus. So, that holistic approach, I hope is something that organizations are taking really seriously right now. The other is this idea of invisible censorship. Priscilla mentioned it in terms of more authoritarian governments, specifically clamping down on freedom of press, of freedom of expression. And, we're seeing this, whether it's, not issuing press passes, or, preventing reporters from being out reporting, or harassing, or police officers harassing reporters. This is a constant challenge that we have to navigate, even when reporters are deemed essential services in some of these places around the world. So these are things that we have our radar up for. And again, the most important thing for us is the holistic security of the whole person, not just the story that we're going after.
Great. So a quick lightning round. We have like 1 or 2 minutes left. Just a few words, like what thought would you leave the donor community with in this question of, environmental safety, COVID, riots, demonstrations? Like, what's your parting shot, if you will?
I can start. I would ask donors first a question. Have you prioritized duty of care in your grant making? And if you have, that's fantastic. But you also need to be asking the tough questions of your grantees. Are they prioritizing safety and security at the very least, but ideally duty of care? And how much are they putting aside to value the wellness of their staff?
Okay, I'll chip in here. So that my pointer to funders is that there is often a nervousness about filmmakers that by being candid and open and frank about risk, it can lead to the withdrawal of funding, which I think is completely not the case. So sometimes what filmmakers want is not so much the financial input, which of course is important, but they actually want some reassurance and hand-holding that there is a funder in the background. They may never call upon you, but knowing that you're there gives them the reassurance, because being out in the field can be a very lonely existence. And knowing that there is someone back at home who is there watching your back effectively can be very reassuring and can give the reassurance also funders need. So
true. Priscilla.
I guess I'd say 2 things. One is let's also, I would propose we broaden our own lexicon to include lexicons that aren't also generated in the global north, right? So when we talk about self-care or duty of care, or, we should also talk about bien vivir and like other global south rooted methodologies of describing the same thing, but not ask the grantees to then explain theirs in our terms, but really being open to think about how this is played out. Because if I go to one of my partners and say, like, what's your safety and security assessment? I'm probably not gonna, get what people are expecting. But if I have a conversation using the lexicon and the vocabulary and the knowledge that's rooted locally, that will be much more effective. And then the last thing is trust. So like if you trust an activist enough to invite them to a panel, fund them in an easy, flexible, unbureaucratic way. If you trust them enough for them to come lend their credibility and their authenticity in a conversation, they should be also supported to protect themselves. And if security could mean buying food, it could mean leaving their community, that's for them to decide.
That's super, you guys. Thank you so much. That's the end of our time, and I'm going to hand it back to Vince, and we have a Q&A section after. So to those of you in the audience, there are great resources in the chat. Please avail yourself of those, and thank you guys. That was a great conversation. I'm sure we'll have some good questions too.
Thank you, Molly. That was a really great way of blending a lot of information in a short period of time. And really interesting to see the complementary nature of both parts of the conversation. I want to invite people to offer questions now. There's a Q&A box down at the bottom. I think we're going to invite one person to join us immediately to offer a question in just a moment here. Adrienne Kawali-Lathan from the Bertha Foundation. But before we go to Adrienne's question, I want to just say a few things. One is that we've just published a report, Environmental Media Grant Making, How Funders Are Tipping the Scales Toward Change. It's a brand new report from Media Impact Funders out today, and we're going to have a special session on that on June 18th, where we're going to get into that report in greater detail. And not to offer too much about that, except to say that we are seeing an increase in grant making for environmental media. So that's encouraging. It's probably not nearly enough to do the job that we need done. But we're also very much encouraged by recent moves by major foundations. We had Ellen Dorsey on just a couple days ago. She made a very strong case for greatly increasing foundation dollars for urgent needs in a time of COVID, in a time of crisis, in a time of a global climate crisis. And she made a strong case. They're greatly increasing their resources. And now just today, we're seeing the announcement from the Ford Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, and several others that they're going to step up and make very bold contributions as well. Together, 5 foundations making $1.7 billion in additional resources. So we certainly hope that some of those resources go to the critical work of telling these important stories. So it's encouraging that there are more resources coming forward. And then I just want to say to all of our speakers and panelists, you should feel free to join in the questioning. I think it was interesting to hear both sides of the equation today. And if anybody wants to ask a question of each other, you could feel free to do that as well. But before we do that, I want to invite Adrienne. I didn't get the pronunciation, but maybe you can advise us, Adrienne Kawali-Lathan, I think it is.
Certainly, Adrienne Kawali-Lathan. That's
Okay,
great.
thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I have, I guess it's somewhat of a complex or long-winded question, which is why it was harder to type.
Feel free.
I'm representing the Bertha Foundation, and really I loved hearing from you about the relationship between partner grantees and a lot of you talking about the ecosystem. I think at this particular juncture in time, it's structural racism and disparity is at the forefront of everyone's minds. And I'd say that the climate movement, that those disparities exist in every movement that there is, these structural disparities, which of course you all know. And I guess the core question that I'm asking is twofold. Firstly, how is it that, you know, there is a disparity of power between the funders and between the beneficiaries who are in their situation? How do we, in that partner grantee relationship, somehow create more of a horizontal process. When we talk about giving the lead to, let's say in this particular instance, people of color, Blacks, people of color in this particular struggle, how do you go about doing that in a sustainable way that not only builds capacity, but has an end goal of eventually removing, I guess, funders essentially at some point out of the situation? There should always be an end goal whereby there isn't just a one-way flow. And I just wondered if anybody was working with concepts or a means of potentially doing that.
So I can respond to that very quickly. I think so. At the Ford Foundation, we really put our grantees and partners on the driver's seat, right? And that's really the way of the culture of the Ford Foundation at this point. We listen and we learn, and then we support the work of the frontliners based on the needs that they identify. And these conversations don't just happen once a year. These conversations happen all the time. So there's actually, fairly regular communications between Ford and our grantees, because there's so many different moments, right, like happening that we're seeing, especially in crisis moments right now. That's one. And I think the second part is a lot of our funding is flexible core funding. And this is a move that we did about 5 years ago when we launched our BUILD program, where we realized that in order for us to really say we're putting the grantees on the driver's seat, we need to give them the power to do what they need to do with the funds that we're providing them. And so that is something that we're also engaging other philanthropies on doing, is to provide flexible core funding support to their to do more flexible core funding to support to their grantees. Our goal is to, I think at this point we're about at 70% of our grant making is flexible core funding. We'd like to do more. We'd like other philanthropies to do the same. And that's kind of how, that's how we're putting the grantees at the center, for sure.
Adrian, I'm really glad you asked this question. It's something we think about often, and we fund individual storytellers, right? And so much of that is about ensuring that they're telling these stories that not only the world learns from through often through our publication branches, but also that we truly learn from. And so as we fund individuals and they become explorers, like Michael said, we then ask them to participate in a number of other ways in the National Geographic ecosystem, often for our own staff as well. But I've also been thinking, especially lately, about when you're activating funds for acute situations, right? Where people are coming up and we recognize that their voices are necessary to lower the burden of application for those individuals who may be also experiencing severe situations to their family and to their home lives and don't have as much capacity to be like filling out a grant form. And I don't have the answer to this, but it's something that we're thinking about very carefully in terms of just simplifying things. But it just sparks a memory I have of having a conversation with a person who is an Indigenous person who said, look, I don't want to be asking you for money. Like that's not the relationship I want with you. I want a partnership. And that stuck with me for a really long time to figure out how to get rid of that sort of fundee relationship. And as somebody who also sits between those spaces, I recognize how important it is. But I would really just love any advice around that as we move forward with our funding as well.
I guess the root of that would be the idea of trust too.
I agree. Can I add 2 more points too? So what's interesting is because philanthropy is such a black box, right? The people don't have the lens of who's working in philanthropy right now. And a lot of the people working, at least the Ford Foundation, are folks who come from the front lines as well. So, so they understand exactly what the needs are of frontline leaders and organizations on the ground who are dealing with issues, in front of them. What I would say is philanthropy is interesting because you do have a bird's eye view of the ecosystem of players that are, that are doing the work. And a big part of our work is to connect, those leaders and organizations on the front lines so that they could, work together, and then we could provide more support, in their collaborations. Yeah, so I think that's kind of two of the, two more points to add.
I'll also just, briefly say that often when we open an RFP, it's because we want to learn about something. And so, we recently opened an RFP around equity in the natural world, which is really about environmental racism and justice. In part because I think that the first people who start to raise these kinds of questions and issues are often the storytellers and the journalists. And then later on, the academics sort of catch up and recognize what those stories may be. And so we often use these as tools to learn about what the next thing may be, and as a reason to start asking those questions.
Thanks.
Priscilla.
Can I add something not as a funder? I want to just go back to this term that I'm in love with that I heard yesterday around language justice, right? Which is more just about actual languages, and it's about, the way we understand the value and the way we ask grantees. I'm saying we as if I'm a funder, but I'm not. The way grantees are asked to explain their values and their objectives and their strategies and their outcomes and their outputs is needs to be decolonized, let me say it that way, because it just needs to be, I think, going back to Tracy's point on trust, like if you trust this group, just give them an easy way to access and to report back, and make it long, no sneaky 1-year projects. We know nothing happens in a year, let's do 5-year timelines, let's do 10-year timelines, let's really put our money where our trust is in really meaningful ways. And I do want to do a hat tip to the BUILD program, because it is what Mark said it is, in terms of really putting the fundee in the driver's seat.
I think it's a good point that Mark brought up about frontline workers. That's who I was for many years, and now I'm in the position of working within philanthropy as well, and making those grants, and really being able to walk our creatives and our makers through the process of, like, you don't need to make up stories, you don't need to, create something just for us. Let's just make it simple. Let's get the barriers down. I just want to support the work to happen. And they're always shocked. Like, I get you. I've been there for 20 years and I'm in this position now. And I think that for those of us who are in these institutions of philanthropy and in these positions of power and gatekeeping, if we could bring more frontline persons into these spaces for that very reason, to break down the barriers and really make this process much more simple and activated for the people who need these resources and who have stories to tell.
If I can say something, just to add to what Tracy has just said, I think many times people who really want to tell those stories are not given the opportunity to tell the story. And the other lady said, I can't remember her, the Brazilian from Witness, she said something that really stood out with me, is that, sometimes the language required to get these projects, it's so technical, it's so hard. Why not create a system whereby, you can talk with the people, it's like somebody said, it's all about trust. Come, tell me what it is that you want to do. I shouldn't have to be able to write all these technical documents that sometimes it really makes no sense. It just takes up quite a lot of time. Of course, I know you have your objectives and your goals, what needs to happen. But at the same time, I think making it easier for the average storyteller, someone who is not familiar even with written language, because there are some people, you know, in our languages, for example, you know, it's not written, but they can express themselves and say, no, this is what I want, but they're not able to write it because English or Spanish or Portuguese may not be their first language. You know, they may have grown up all the time with their native languages. And I think making it easy for them to access, you know, resources, I think can help push this process forward. And it's maybe something that, you know, donors need to, you know, consider as well. You know, why not make it a little bit easier? You can test run it, you know, make a little smaller, one smaller, and then you get bigger as you go along, but find simple ways of giving the access to the people who really need to tell the stories. Because sometimes you will find that the bigger organizations who know the technical thing will be getting the grants, but maybe the persons who really should benefit it are not getting it. So it's something for us to consider and, you know, make it easier for those who really need it to actually have access to it.
I think it's great to see the dialogue between the panels. And I just want to invite our panelists, if you have a question of each other, raise your hand, and I'm happy to you know, facilitate that dialogue as well. In the meantime, if anybody has a question from the participants, the Q&A box is there as well. I might just, does somebody have a question? Well, I might just ask Michael to elaborate a little bit, which is to say, building on what you were responding to Priscilla, were there other aspects of the resources for safety and security of frontline workers? Is there something in your experience that where that is either responsive to your needs, or whether there's something that you experience which is not being, is there a gap in what you heard?
Thank you for your question. I think in every situation, it can be different. There may be gaps, but I think there are also ways in which well it's actually working. So for example, currently, there's a situation here where a family is being threatened by large-scale miners with guns and things like that. The family wants me to go in with them to their location, but personally for me to go there, you know, I will have that fear because it's putting myself at risk as well, because here we have a family being threatened by persons who have the firearms, persons who have money with them. They have a lot of money, so they can do what they want and pass through court. It's easy for them, but it's also in a remote location. So for me to go with them to tell their story can be putting myself at risk. And many times it's difficult because the security forces may not be able to, well, find ways of protecting me and ensure that I'm safe. So I gotta try first and foremost to ensure my safety. And many times it could be difficult, it could be hard because we're not seen as priority. The security forces may have their own priorities set, and I may not be a priority for them. While I put my life on the line to ensure that someone's story is told or someone gets visibility for what is happening, you know, it can be putting myself at risk. So I think it's important for us as well as storytellers to ensure that we pay special attention to protecting ourselves as much as we can, because no one will look for you in that sense. So you have to start first with your own self. So we need to be careful. We need to ensure, and I like that, you know, some of the guidelines that were put out, that, you know, these are some of the things that need to take into consideration when getting into something like this, because anything can happen. You know, I can go there and next thing I'm missing, nobody can find me because somebody got me on the trail coming back and dumped me in a tree trunk or something. But this is the reality of the situation on the ground. And even without that, then there is the other side of, like, for example, in our jungles, we have jaguars, we have anacondas, we have piranhas, and all of these things. as a storyteller going out there, sleeping in the jungle, walking through the jungle, I need to bear these things at the back of my mind as well and take certain precautions to ensure that I am safe. Because I don't want somebody else to be telling the story about me, got eaten by a jaguar. And I can't be telling that story on my own, so I just need to protect myself. Yeah.
Molly, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question that I think actually it'd be interesting to hear from all of the panelists, whoever has a reaction to it. But I think over my career, for sure, one of the things that has definitely happened is a blending of the roles of journalists and filmmakers and activists and citizens, and all with valid like roles and reasons and outcomes for participating, but within our little space, quite different motivations or, you know, rules of operating and, you know, processes. I just wonder how that blend, I think the public, the distinctions that we would make between ourselves are lost on the public. So I'm just curious from where you guys sit, like how has that blending benefited or challenged, you know, the group you work with or the kind of work you do? You know, is there a way out of that you know, if it's negative for your organization that feels good? I'd just be really interested in thoughts on that.
You know, one of the things that we've always kind of, well, there's a couple of things that I can say about this, Molly. The first is at Global Press for years we have been talking about the asset that is our reporters who live in so many different communities and speak so many different languages and can access so many different sources that very unlikely a foreign correspondent is ever going to be able to access. And even if they are you going to get the whole truth? Is your source going to trust that reporter? So there's a real conversation there to have about the value that comes with engaging with local communities and the access that they have. And the fact that, you know, this conversation about objectivity right now in our field, you know, we are all human beings. We have organizations that support us with policies and fact checkers and all sorts of processes like we provide at Global Press. But as an individual, the access that our reporters have to these communities is an asset. And then, you know, we've always had a non-assignment policy at Global Press, which is, again, wild for a newsroom. Send a reporter out and have them tell you what's most important for their community right now to be hearing about, to be learning about. And, you know, simple policies like this have also really been the fabric of what makes Global Press such a diverse organization.
I think it's important to encourage a degree of collaboration between the different types of filmmakers, journalists, activists, because certainly in the area that Doc Society works in, we work across all these different areas. And it's interesting, historically, filmmakers always saw themselves as storytellers first, seldom as journalists. And journalists were always very sniffy about filmmakers because they were storytellers, they didn't stick to the facts, and they weren't very objective. I think these kind of descriptions are slightly outdated in many ways, because as you say, Molly, the audience doesn't really distinguish between one and the other. What it's about is the integrity of the film and the contents as they're then subsequently distributed. But I think fundamentally, when it comes down to the whole issue of risk around these different types of individuals, you can embed and you can ingrain a culture of safety and security. But ultimately, when it comes down to the decision making, you are the filmmaker on the ground. It's all very well seeking advice from me, but I'm back in Sydney in cozy office or wherever. I'm not there to make those value judgments for you. So we can only empower those individuals to make the best situation or the best decisions with the best facts available at that time. It's interesting what Michael was saying about his analysis of going into a community and assessing, is he going to go in and come out? Is he going to be able to tell that community's stories? Because if he's seriously injured or dead, that story's gone. And we hope that over the years, the kind of approach of the more gung-ho filmmakers, and they are a very small minority, has been changed with a more measured and proportionate and evaluating a filmmaker that thinks about I want to get my story out, but it's going to be at quite a serious price I'm going to have to pay. So maybe now's not the time, or maybe there's another way of doing it. And that kind of rational thinking is what we want to encourage and sort of facilitate more.
Can I add a few thoughts?
Please.
Time? No?
Yeah, I think Michael also had an inclination to speak too.
Oh, so thank you, sorry. Yeah, indeed. And I think with the changing environment now, everybody has a smartphone, everybody go out there, something is happening, they film it, they throw it up on social media, things are changing. The environment we're working is changing. And I think as a result of this, there needs to be more collaboration between the different types of media out there. I think this is the way forward. It should no longer be about, this is my circle, I'll just work with this. No, we have to work together if we're going to tell the true stories, because the manner in which media is operating now, it's so hard sometimes. Well, we hear a lot about fake news and all sort of things, but it's important for us to recognize that if we're going to get the true stories, then we have to take it from all the angles and from all the individuals involved. And I think for us, it is important that, telling our story, because this stories that we're going to tell has to fit as well into the environment that exists. We have to tell it in such a way that people understand it. We have to tell it in such a way that people appreciate it and people know, like, these are the facts. We have evidence to support what we're saying. And in the work that I'm doing, this is our intention. We're not just going to tell you a story, but we will give you the evidence to show, look, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about people gathering in a certain area. We can show you. We have georeference photos. We have maps that we can prove to you. We can give you the evidence. We can show you specifically on a map. So it's important for us to recognize that in telling our story, we need to have evidence-based facts that we can show to you and tell that story. Thank
you. A quick comment from Priscilla, and then we'll wrap.
I was just going to say the importance of collaboration. I think there's immense power in the new ecosystem and the new landscape of how we work together, but it also requires a very strong recognition of whose stories and who should be telling those stories and who they belong to, right? And I think everyone supporting that needs to get rid of their own agendas, their own egos, their own professional ambitions, and really service the more collective goals that we have with these stories, the more collective counter-narrative goals that we have with these stories. I love some of the filmmakers that have been supported by Bertha, for example, who before they even start to think about what documentary they want to make, they understand what story the community wants to tell, kind of like how Lakshmi was describing the global press model. And I think that's what we need more of.
That's a great place to end the conversation too, because I think it shows exactly how collaborative it could be with all the different perspectives, all the way from the funder through to the storyteller and the intermediaries in between. I want to thank Adrian for getting this discussion, the Q&A discussion started with such a thoughtful conversation starter there. And for all of you participants and moderators together, maybe a special thanks to Prash Naik for getting up in the middle of the night. When we reached out to Doc Society, we thought we were inconveniencing them at cocktail hour in London, but we didn't realize it was going to be 13, 14 hours in Sydney. So thank you for getting up very early for us for all of that.
You'll have a productive day, Prash.
Really. Maybe you'll go back to that. But anyway, I do also want to just bring your attention to our next gathering. Our next meeting of the forum is next Tuesday at 1 o'clock, where we're going to focus on the Daily Planet, environmental journalism around the world. We've got some great speakers on that program as well. And at the end of this session, when you when you get out of Zoom, please follow the prompts, if you will, to take our short 6-question, 3-minute survey at the conclusion. And thank you all for participating. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Tracy.